So, welcome, George. We're back. This is our second episode, and really, it's time now to dig into a little bit into that Belmont station. You gave us a really interesting picture of the history and why the North really desperately needed a different type of breed or cattle. And now we're really talking about the Belmont research station and how that came about. So, over to you.
Well, basically the program, as I stated earlier, Dr. Jim Rendell, right, philosophically he said, Kelly convinced us and knew that the Indian subcontinent had highly adapted cattle, which were, obvious great advantage in crossing with the established British breeds. But he said Africa also has a huge number of adapted cattle, and we need to include some strain from Africa to balance it out, to know that we're getting the best of the tropical breeds. Finally, all genetics, we don't talk about breeds, so it's the best of African genetics that we know of. The obvious one was Afrikaner from South Africa. It was well known. There was a lot of documentation on it, from even, I suppose, from Pretoria University, from so that it was the obvious one. But you could not bring any cattle from Africa into Australia. Even at that time, this is the early 1950s, but you could at that time still bring cattle from North America. King Ranch, Texas, had in the 1930s imported a small cohort of Afrikaners from two Afrikaner studs in the Orange Free State of South Africa and used them in their breeding program. King Ranch, of course, is the home of the Santa Gertrudis in Texas, in the place Beeville. So King Ranch, Texas, and the Santa Gertrudis. So,
wow.
And similar to the results we saw here in Australia, the crosses, the Brahman cross on the then Texas longhorn and shorthorn type of cattle, and Spanish Creole cattle that roamed, that were the basis of the Texas herds, the Brahman in the experiments done at King Ranch demonstrated that the first cross Brahman was superior. It was superior to the Afrikaner cross in growth. And at the time, the most obvious trait we were looking at, everybody was looking at, is growth, is weight. Easy to measure, easy to see. You can visually see it, and you can measure it very simply. So everybody concentrated on weight, weight gain, size. So King Ranch, Texas, kept a small cohort of purebred Afrikaners.
Right.
I believe as a geneticist that King Ranch did use some Afrikaner in the Santa Gertrudis, mainly to fix the red color.
Okay.
Because the Brahman cross to the British breeds, you get a huge scatter of colors, and you can fix that quite readily with one cross of Afrikaner.
Right.
But they kept them as a novelty herd, and unfortunately kept quite good records. And, I was fortunate to be given a grant to do my PhD in America later in life, or not that late. And I had correspondence with a geneticist at King Ranch, a chap named Black, and he sent me all the original Afrikaner records from the Orange Free State herds of the Afrikaners. We imported them. So the only way we could get African genetics was through King Ranch. Wilson was sent over there to select both Brahmins and Afrikaners. King Ranch supplied the Afrikaners. Hudgens, one of the top Brahmin studs, even today in the United States. A lot of bulls were bought from Hudgens because, the stud name is more important than the cattle. And another one in Florida, Frost, two well-known Brahmin styles. Now, coming back, the Brahmin, and we should just quickly dwell on that. The Brahmin is a mixture of Indian breeds.
Ah,
And it's the Gujarat, the Nellore, and I just can't recall the third one, but the Brazilians took these two, mainly the Nellore and the Gujarat from the north and the Nellore from the south, took them over in the 1800s to Brazil
okay.
because they recognized that they needed them. And so they were crossed with the Criollo cattle from Spain and Portugal. And gradually, because of the adaptability and again the advantages, spread fairly rapidly through Brazil, through Colombia, up the Panama-ish, right around and found their way in Mexico. And by the time the Americans in the 1930s were struggling with their shorthorn type cattle, looking across that huge dry
The
river
fence.
called the Rio Grande from Texas, they could see that there were some very interesting cattle across there.
Right.
So they walked them across into Texas from Mexico. And to the Americans, everything Indian was a Brahmin. The religious sect,
Ah,
the religious
okay.
leader, Brahmin, with the I-N at the end. So
Uh-huh.
they just called them Brahman, A-N. So this is the origin of the Brahmin. And
Interesting.
so it developed in Texas. So it was an easy one. We couldn't get any cattle from India as well. So that was the source of the cattle coming into Australia. And Wilson brought them. The interesting thing that happened in 1954, that's when Belmont was bought and established and taken over by CS. We managed to in 1954. The consignment of cattle for CSRO from the United States, and there was some Santa Gertrudis for King Ranch had established a ranch in central Queensland as well. Now, they had some Santa Gertrudis on board that same consignment of ship. The gate was closed. Our cattle were the very last cattle, live cattle, to be imported to Australia, and we just made it.
Right.
Because after that, America, there was foot and mouth in America, and that shut the door.
Right.
So we got this. We got a fair sample of Brahmins, mainly bulls and some cows, all with good names, good pedigrees. Picadas were nondescript. They had pedigree, but could be followed. They were highly inbred, extremely inbred, because they had been just kept as a small herd and left to their own on King Ranch since the 1930s.
Right.
I did do a little exercise when I looked at the coefficients of inbreeding later, and it was extremely high in that cohort. So they looked miserable compared to the Brahmins to start off with, and were subject to an increased amount of criticism, especially by the stockmen on the research station. That was the start. So we had our Herefords and Shorthorns in residence. So the basic program was we had straight Hereford, straight Shorthorns, Brahmin Hereford, Brahmin Shorthorn, Afrikaner Hereford, Afrikaner Shorthorn, and then also Hereford Shorthorn, Shorthorn Hereford, so the cross to eliminate any hybrid vigor effects to look at,
Right.
and so we could look at it. Yeah, basically, we found probably what the Texans had found but not recorded, is that the Brahmin cross F1 was the superior animal by significant in weight. The Afrikaner cross is the most notable thing you can say about them is it astounded the stockmen that what the calves looked like when they looked at the bulls, which
Okay.
were half the size of the Brahmin bulls. Out came some very good, because the difference between the Afrikaner cross, whether it was Hereford Shorthorn or Hereford Brahmin Shorthorn, Brahmin Hereford, very little difference. Afrikaner Shorthorn, Afrikaner Hereford, very little difference. The difference was in the sire lines, not the maternal way. So all the cattle at Belmont, every one of them, finally in the wash-up of the program years down the line, all had the same mothers, all had the same genetic pool. A
Right.
cow one year could have had a Brahmin, been mated to a Brahmin, and the next year to an Afrikaner, and the
Oh.
next year to a straight Hereford. They weren't distinct lines. We circulated every year, we re-randomized all the cows across the bull breeds. We needed the genetic variation. That's what us
Mm-hmm.
genetic work on. Without variation, we've got nothing.
Right.
And so is nature. So we had these lines, and it confirmed it. I joined CSIRO, as I said, as a resident experimental officer on the research. I was thrown into the deep end. The herds weren't being well run then. I reorganized a lot of it. I quantified, I restructured a lot of the records just because I was there, and I was fascinated by it. And John Kennedy said to me, they were thinking, and we had an advisory committee, of dispensing with the Afrikaner cross line because all the scientists were interested in the Brahmin crosses and the British. This was a huge difference. So the bigger the difference, the more variability, the more you could, apply high science to do this, to account for these differences. And we were starting to produce the first F2 generation, or had produced some of them. And I was looking through the weights and re-recording them for my own use or for posterity. This is pre-computers, all hand done. And I just happened to look, and what was quite obvious, that's for every 100 Afrikaner cross cows, significantly more calves without a statistic. So in the F2, the F1 was the same, the fertility, but in the F2, the Afrikaner crosses were producing quite a few more calves per 100 cows.
Mm.
Also, the differences weren't that big in weight. So if you constructed a very simple little index and said, let's evaluate these two strains of cattle, call them that, and the Herefords were weighed down on everything in any case, it didn't matter, and say it's a productivity index. Let's say it's the amount of calf or beef produced at weaning per 100 cows. Multiply the number of calves by the average weight.
Right.
And suddenly the F2 Afrikaner cross was superior to the Brahmin cross on that statistic. More calves, and I think economists have now shown the most important driver of profitability in any herd is reproduction, fertility.
Fertility. Yep.
Absolutely. And it's the more difficult one genetically to handle. It's easy, and it's difficult to see. Again, talking to the cattle industry, I was giving a talk, and I mentioned this. I said the fertility of the Brahmin cross wasn't as good. And one of the graziers stood up, he said, I don't know why you're on about this damn fertility of Brahmin crosses. He said, I've got Brahmin crosses. Now, these guys are talking 10,000 head of cattle. He said, I've got Brahmin crosses, he said, and everyone has all my cows have had calves. He said, and what's more, some of them calf every year. Yeah. I said to him, does your bank charge you interest? How does they charge interest on the loans you take from them? It's per year.
Right.
But he still didn't get the argument. So you've got to be very careful when you start talking about these. Anyway, so that in effect stalled. And the whole research program at Rockhampton then up to that point was directed at accounting for the differences in growth.
Right.
Easy to measure, easy to handle, easy to do studies on. Beautiful scientific papers produced for international journals, but of very little value practically.
Right.
So that was when I started saying, we've got to look at fertility, and I started programs on research of fertility. But that was then the start of it. And I'll stop there because this is from here on starts the story of the Belmont. The red.
Fabulous, fabulous.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for that.
Yeah.
So in the next episode, we will really start talking Belmont, the differences you saw, the rigor you brought to the program. That's going to be very exciting. Thank you, George. Speak to you soon.
Okay. Thank you. Good talking to you. Bye.
Bye.